5 debut All-Stars. Karl Malone, that was his first of 14 All-Star games. Brad Doherty had... Was that your dog in the background?
Sorry. Sit down!
Jordan retired in 98. That was his final All-Star game as a Bull. He came back, obviously, and played in a couple. Yeah, he did. That's right. Thanks to your dog there for chiming in. Professionalism personified there with the dog in the background. We'll keep that in there. That was great. Shout out to Antoine Carr and also Glenn Robertson.
Then you are in Australia right now.
You're talking NBA basketball. You're talking great teams. You're talking great individual players.
Takes it off, and there's number 23, and of course Johnny goes nuts.
We're all getting goosebumps thinking about it now.
I just tried to go out there and play my game.
I have no idea what you're talking about, Adam. I don't like anybody. I'm not a people person.
Strand, you made the pass, yes. Christian, can you catch the ball? Yes.
All the stars were aligned and all the muscles fired at the right time, and I was able to get off the ground and throw one down.
I was saving that as a surprise for you.
And now, introducing your host for In All Airness, Adam Ryan.
I'd like to welcome back to the show again today a good friend, Aaron Steen. How are you, mate?
Adam, thank you for having me back, mate.
No worries at all. Now, today, we're going to be devoting the entire episode to the 1988 NBA All-Star Game, which was held in Chicago. I've been looking forward to this chat for some time now.
Yeah, when I was a young fella and first started getting into the NBA, my first exposure to it was Michael Jordan, Come Fly With Me, and the 88 All-Star Game, it featured on that video. And I think it was about 10 years in between when I first saw footage from that All-Star Game to when I actually saw the game. So you can imagine how excited I would have been having to wait 10 years to try to see the game, but it definitely lived up to my expectations.
Slightly slower than what you'd expect with the internet age these days. You can pretty much watch things either live as they happen or at least on delay only by a couple of hours, courtesy of YouTube and all the wonders of the internet. One of the great All-Star games ever. It was the 38th annual All-Star game and held at Chicago Stadium in Chicago, Illinois. It was on February the 7th of 1988 and the telecast was by CBS. So this is in the last few years of their run of the NBA on CBS before NBC took over in 1991.
I was going to ask you, when did you first see the game itself?
I remember getting a VHS copy of it through a local sports store in my hometown in Bendigo in Victoria. They used to rent out copies of games through the store for some reason. I'm not even too sure why, but I do remember getting a copy of it, but it was a pretty poor quality VHS. It was probably a second or third generation copy of the game, but it was probably in 1990 or 91. They just had a handful of VHS tapes, and that was one of the games I got to see. It was pretty cool, though, still going home and chucking it in the old VCR.
Yeah, definitely. As I said, it was about 10 years until I actually saw the other game itself. And for you to say that they had a VHS copy at a video store in Bendigo, oh my God, like if I had found that in Horsham on Come Fly With Me, it features in that video. And it was a long, long wait till I actually got to saw it. But yeah, that would have been magnificent.
Yeah, it was pretty cool. It actually was from the local sports store. It wasn't actually
sports store.
Yeah, it wasn't actually a video store. Because I was in there so frequently looking at sneakers and stuff like that back in the day, I somehow found out they had some old NBA games on tape, and one of them happened to be the 88 All-Star Game. I paid a couple of bucks and borrowed the tape and then almost played it to death and handed it back a couple of weeks later, and I still remember watching it from more than 20 years ago. So some very fond memories, and I'd head straight out into the backyard and try and do some of Jordan's moves, and I'd barely be able to hit the ring, mate. So, yeah, not quite as good as I'd hoped.
Did that VHS copy have the All-Star Weekend as well?
It had the three-point shootout and the dunk contest on there. It was poorly edited, though, and there was no Legends game. It was just the bits and pieces of the three-point shootout and then the dunk comp as well.
The amount of clips, the amount of things that I'd read about that game over that 10-year span until I actually saw the game, it was such a cool thing to be able to get all that info that I'd had in my head and kind of piece it all together in the game as to when certain plays happened and whatnot. It was very cool.
I did mention to you when we had a chat on the phone a couple of days ago, I'll admit it here now, when I was watching the player introductions pre-game, and then also followed by the national anthem, which was by a guy called Al Jarreau. I was actually getting a bit choked up and emotional seeing when I got to Jordan, and he was just so happy and smiling pre-introduction there when Tommy Edwards read out his name, and the crowd just went absolutely berserk as he got introduced. It does show that I'm quite a soppy old man at this stage. I was getting quite choked up.
No, that's all fair enough, mate. And the first time that I heard it, I was wondering where the heck Ray Clay was as well, because Tommy Edwards was the PA man for the Bulls at that time and is again now. But, well, of course, I didn't know that at that point in time. So I'm like, who the heck is this guy on the PA? I want Ray Clay.
Yeah, Ray Clay is pretty much, for a lot of fans, is synonymous with the Bulls as the PA announcer. As you say, Tommy Edwards is now back as the Bulls PA announcer as we record in 2013. This game also featured a lot of Chicago area products as well. You've got guys like Mo Cheeks, Mark Aguirre, Doc Rivers, Isaiah Thomas. Interestingly, a couple of players who were introduced, and most notably Danny Ainge, when he was actually first introduced to the East lineup, he was given a very unfriendly welcome from the Chicago fans.
I think that you'll also hear Kevin McHale got a similar reaction from the crowd when he was introduced, but it was kind of funny to hear a Chicago product being Isaiah Thomas. He got soundly and roundly booed when he got introduced in the starting lineups.
Yeah, he did. That relates back to the alleged freeze-out from the 1985 All-Star Game, which gets mentioned on numerous occasions by the commentators. And the commentators were Dick Stockton and Billy Cunningham. Pat O'Brien was playing the Bob Costas-esque role higher up in the Chicago Stadium during the halftime breaks and whatnot. Isaiah certainly copped it from the crowd. And Larry Legend, though, he got a good ovation from the crowd when he was introduced. It was interesting to see a couple of the players booed, even though it was an All-Star Game.
I'm not sure if you noticed this or not, but as each of the East and West were being introduced to the crowd at Chicago Stadium, behind each player, before they ran out onto the court, there was a gentleman with some headphones on. He had his hand on the shoulder of the player, and I guess it was time for the player to get up and run out for their introductions when he gave him the okay. It was funny to see Kareem actually brush him off, like, don't touch me, get your hand off me. And then up the other end for the East, you had a more elderly gentleman. I'm not sure exactly who he was, but he was a bit more assertive with his hand. No one definitely brushed him off.
No, exactly right. I started giggling when you were even talking about that because I knew Kareem was less than impressed to have the hand on his left shoulder, and he brushed it away and had a look of semi-disgust for a few seconds and then hopped onto the court as well. But yeah, that's quite interesting you mentioned that. That was the introductions, and we had a really good rendition of the national anthem from Al Jarreau. And when he hit the last few notes of the national anthem, that's again when I started to get a few hairs on the back of the neck standing up and the crowd get right into it. And then you just transform back to that time, even though it's 25 years plus since that actually took place.
Yeah, a great way to introduce the All-Stars to the crowd. I'm, as you are, more old school, and I prefer that old-fashioned way of, like the introductions rather than the glitz and glamour that you see now with the NBA. But it was funny to see Tommy Edwards gave each of the players a quick description before they ran out on the court, and when he described Xavier McDaniel as strong and quick, you see the X-Man have a bit of a giggle to himself, like, yeah, sure, whatever. Both lineups for the East and the West, if you have a look at them, there was only one guy, being Steve Johnson, who couldn't play in the game because of injury. So you had the other full array of All-Stars from 1988. And if you have a look at the other lineups, in particular, the starting lineups, they're very, very cool 1980s NBA lineups.
Oh, yeah, no doubt about that, mate. And the entire Eastern starting unit, Larry Bird, Dominic Wilkins, MJ, Isaiah and Moses Malone, they're all Hall of Famers. And for the West, their starters were Magic Johnson, Karl Malone, Fat Lever, Hakeem Olajuwon and Alex English. And with the exception of Fat Lever, all the Western starters are also Hall of Famers too.
Yeah, and Fat Lever, as I've said ad nauseum over the 80 or 100 podcasts that I've done with you up to this point, Fat Lever, probably, in my eyes, the most underrated player in NBA history. That was really cool to see him get a bit of recognition from the fans in 88 and start in the game for the West.
Without doubt. He was only 6'3", but in the 1988 season, he was 29th overall in NBA rebounds per game at 8.1, which is pretty much staggering. There was 332 players who laced it up in that season, and he was 29th overall. He was the only guy probably under 6'6" who was in the top 50 or more in terms of rebounds. So he was out rebounding some of the elite or mid-level centers of the 1980s.
Yeah, I've mentioned on more than one occasion during the pods that I've done with you, mate, my thoughts on Fat Lever, a 6'3" guard who on more than one occasion averaged over 7 rebounds a game, like to go along with his scoring, and 8 to 10 assists as well. Just one of the most underrated guys ever, mate.
For sure. The reserves for both teams are also scattered with numerous Hall of Famers too. Just a fantastic all-star game with some all-time great players. As we talk about different players and coaches in this episode, mate, I'm going to include in the show notes links to interviews that have been done by a good friend of ours, Adam Howes, who has his own great website. It's a Chicago-centric website called bullsonparade.me. Recently, he's been very fortunate to interview both the X-Man, Xavier McDaniel, at length, a really great interview which is up on the Above the Rim website that he writes for as well. But also he did a great chat with Dominique Wilkins, the Human Highlight film, which I'll also include links to in this episode. I've also been fortunate to speak with Mike Fratello, who was the head coach of the Eastern team in this 88 All-Star game. So I'll include a link to that conversation as well in the show notes. Visit inallairness.com/38.
Yeah, it was a big thrill for Adam, and it was an even bigger thrill for me personally, being a Dominique fan since I first fell in love with the NBA. It was a big thrill that he got a chance to either speak to Nick, and there's been a couple of questions that I've always had unanswered over the other years about Dominique and certain things that happened in his career, and Adam put forward those questions about his trade from the Hawks to the LA Clippers back in 1994 and goings on from the All-Star weekend that we're talking about now in 1988, and his feelings on being a bit shortchanged in the dunk competition. bullsonparade.me, a great read for any NBA fans.
Yeah, definitely, mate. The coaches for each team, we had Mike Fratello as the head coach of the East. He was the head man for the Atlanta Hawks at that time. And Pat Riley was the head man for the Western Conference. And interestingly, when I was watching back the game in advance to our chat today, I was surprised to hear that Pat Riley's brother passed away just days before the game itself. So that was a huge effort for him to even be there still, given the fact that his brother had died just a few days earlier.
Yeah, true.
With the Eastern Conference team, mate, we had 3 Boston Celtics: Kevin McHale, Larry Bird, and also Danny Ainge. For the Western team, we had 3 LA Lakers players, and they were Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Magic Johnson, and James Worthy. The game itself, mate, it featured plenty of highlights. The first couple of plays, though, that you could just tell that they were very MJ-centric. There was a couple of failed alley-oops from Larry Bird and Isaiah Thomas trying to set up MJ from the get-go. So you could tell that it was pretty clear that the modus operandi was to get MJ the ball early and often.
Yes, the pace of the game at the start was really, really fast. As you mentioned, the first 2 East plays were alley-oops to Dominique and MJ, and 88 being Jordan's Defensive Player of the Year award. Apart from a missed shot, his first stat was a block shot early in the first quarter.
That's true. He got that big block on Alex English, I think it was, and that led to a fast break dunk for none other than the Human Highlight film, Dominique Wilkins.
Yeah, that is correct. And it was good to see, as in a lot of the All-Star games back in the 80s and 90s as well, that the players were actually played hard in the game. Like, they actually had a lot of pride in having been named an All-Star. And the pace of the game was awesome to watch. It was a really fast-paced start to the game.
It was very frenetic, and then also there were numerous turnovers as well in that first quarter. As actually throughout the game, there's quite a few turnovers, but you could see that they were just amped and ready to go and putting on a show early for the fans. Now, Magic Johnson had 19 assists in this game. Isaiah had 15, but both were also turnover laden as well.
And those 2 guys, being Isaiah and Magic, were absolutely perfect for All-Star games, because off an inbounds or off a defensive rebound, they would push the ball up the court so fast and just add to the fast pace of the game. And there were guys that were true showmen of the game as well, in particular Magic, of course. But yeah, just some of the passing and the fast pace, which led to a few turnovers at the start. But even the other turnovers were drawing oohs and ahs from the crowd. It was good fun to watch.
Oh yeah, the crowd were right into it from the very opening jump. Now, you did mention earlier as well, Steve Johnson, who was at the time playing with the Portland Trailblazers. He missed the game due to injury, and he was replaced by James Donaldson for his first and only All-Star game. At the time, Steve Johnson was averaging about 18 points and 6 boards a game, so he was putting up some great numbers, but unfortunately missed a month or 2 of the season at the wrong time for him, and he missed out on playing the game. You could actually tell by the look on his face as well during the introduction. He didn't give any high fives out as he was introduced. He just strolled on the court and was quite matter of fact. So pretty tough to get your one call up for the All-Star game and actually miss it through injury. And one other quick thing, we will get to some questions that we've been asked by a listener of the show about 2 different things that he's wanting to have our thoughts on. So we'll get to that a bit later on, mate. But what are your thoughts quickly about the Steve Johnson, James Donaldson?
Yeah, I'm sure that Steve Johnson would have been quite crushed that he didn't get to play in the game a la Cedric Sabalas in 1995, who was selected for the game but didn't get to play. The other reason that Steve Johnson may have been upset was, you mentioned before that we're going to be answering a couple of questions from one of the other listeners, but I'm going to answer one right now. Steve Johnson would undoubtedly have had to have been upset, A, because he missed the game, and B, who replaced him in the game as well. And the guy that replaced him in the game, James Donaldson, would, in my eyes, have to be the worst All-Star in the game's history. Because if you have a look at his stat line of the time in that season, it's quite incredible how he was the one who was chosen to replace Steve Johnson.
At this time, I'd like to say hello to James Donaldson as a future guest on the show. But Johnson was replaced due to injury. Was it a coach selection that gave James Donaldson the nod, or did the NBA select him? How did that actually work, do you know?
I'm not sure. The reserves are chosen by the other coaches, so I could only assume that it may have been the coaches. But actually, I think I've heard in subsequent years when guys have been injured, I think it happened just recently when someone from the East got injured. The NBA actually selected Rajon Rondo to be his replacement in the game. So I think it may have been the league who chose the replacement.
Yeah, I think deep down in the depths of my memory, which is a scary place, I'm pretty sure the NBA may select the replacement players when it's injury involved. Apologies there to James Donaldson if he happens to listen to this, but he will likely be a future guest on the show, so he may not be now after hearing that, but you're entitled to your opinion as well, and it's a fair call given the fact that his numbers didn't reflect what most of the other players did at that time to be in the team in the first place. To give a little bit of context there, his last productive season was probably 1992. After he left the Dallas Mavericks, he went to New York and then finished his career in Utah. And from his rookie season of 1981 through to 1992, he averaged about 9 points, 8 boards, 1 assist, and 1.5 blocks a game. So he had some solid numbers, but perhaps not all-star worthy, to be honest.
Yeah, his numbers in 88 were 7 points, 9 rebounds, 1.3 blocks. So not exactly all-star numbers. And I'll also just, I'll put this little disclaimer in down the bottom as well. I did clear this with you before. I threw James Donaldson under the bus, so don't claim to be the victim.
I'm not claiming to be the victim at all, mate, but I thought I better get some perspective and go with his career numbers up to the point where he was the most productive. That's fine. You're entitled to your opinion, mate, and I'm not going to edit that one out at all. That question actually was provided by Hank McCoy, who is the host of the Courtside podcast. Thank you, Hank, for that question. Your question was, who was the least deserving All-Star from that 1988 All-Star game? So that's the answer to that question there, Hank. And we've got one more question that you have submitted that we'll answer a bit later on in the episode. Do check out the Courtside podcast for a good look at some more NBA coverage of modern day with Australian hosts Hank and Vinrock. All right. Now, mate, let's move on. In 1988, we had a few debut All-Stars, mate. We had Karl Malone. He made the first of 14 All-Star appearances. Brad Doherty from Cleveland, he made the first of his 5. We had Fat Lever, who made the first of his 2 All-Star game appearances. Danny Ainge made his one and only. Doc Rivers, also from the Atlanta Hawks, made his first and only. And then we mentioned James Donaldson already. And you talked about the X-Man, Xavier McDaniel, as well. That was his one and only All-Star game too. I think you could technically say that Patrick Ewing was a debut, but I'm pretty sure he was named to the 86 All-Star squad but missed it due to injury.
I think that you are right, mate. And I'm just going through the debut All-Stars for that year. As always, it's good to see you guys come through and play in the All-Star game. And you also kind of threw me a bit of a curveball there because I wasn't expecting that. And now I'm just really talking into no man's land.
Oh, that's all right, mate. And now the caveat that I will add is that we did mention this on a couple of previous All-Star game reviews that we've done, that if you say that someone's a 14-time All-Star, it doesn't necessarily mean that they played in that many games. For example, Jordan was selected 14 times, but he played in 13 games, and he missed the 86 game as well due to injury. From that first half in particular, any other plays of note or moments that you wanted to chat about?
Well, as a sneaker lover, I feel the need to try to bring up 2 of the other sneakers that were worn in the game. First of all, you had Alvin Robertson wearing the Nike Air Revolution, which was the first ever Nike basketball shoe that had the other visible air unit in it. That was very cool. And, of course, the sneaker that saved Nike, the Air Jordan 3, It was at about that time that Jordan was coming towards the end of his current contract with Nike, and there was a bit of talk about him maybe switching brands for whatever reason, and Nike brought in a little-known architect by the name of Tinker Hatfield, and this was the first Air Jordan that he designed. Needless to say, the rest is history. The black and cement Jordan 3, along with the Jordan 1, probably one of the two most iconic Air Jordans ever.
Agreed. I'd go with the ones personally as my favourite of all time, and the threes are right up there as well. They're probably the two favourite pairs that I've liked over his whole career. I noticed as well on this telecast, mate, that at one of the dead ball situations, or they came back on ad break or something, James Brown was interviewing Mike Tyson in the crowd. He was the then undefeated heavyweight champion of the world. And then once that interview had ended, it was only a quick 30-second chat, they panned out into the crowd, and none other than Oprah Winfrey was about 20 rows back looking on, interestingly as well.
And she had the 1980s head full of hair as well. One thing that I noticed about the other stadium was it had the original downlights in the roof of the stadium, as opposed to the banks of lights that they installed, I think, in 1991. So it had the old school downlights, which I thought was really cool. And on the bench for the East was a very young and much slimmer John Leigmanowski, who is the other long-time, or I think he still is, the other long-time equipment manager for the team.
Yeah, good spotting, mate, there. I like that. There's some really good NBA-related personalities on the bench for both squads as far as the coaches and assistants go. Brendan Sewell was there as well. Brian Hill. Randy Fund, I think, from the West was one of the assistants. Of course, at that time, I'm pretty sure that the head coach of each team would take his assistants or some of his assistants to be part of that coaching squad with them as well.
Yeah, I think that the team, obviously, the Bulls must have had to have supplied some of their own staff for the game as well, because Mark Feil, the trainer, he was on the bench for the East, and as I mentioned before, John Leigmanowski was there as well. So, yeah, a bit of a mix of where the NBA sourced the other staff from for the other benches.
And when they did the player introductions and introduced the coaches for the Eastern squad, Mark Feil came and stood alongside Jordan just prior to the anthem as well, so you could just see a nice little show of affection from each other there as well. After one quarter, the West led 32-27. The East outscored the West by 11 in the second quarter, so at half-time the scores were East were on 60 and the West were on 54. Pretty close contest, high-scoring game, and that leads us into the halftime segment that was put together by CBS, the At the Half, one of the iconic segments back in the 1980s, hosted by Pat O'Brien.
The Prudential at the half. Just had a bit of a rundown on the events of the All-Star weekend, the previous day with the Legends Classic, the dunk competition, and the three-point shootout. The footage of the Legends game was very cool. They highlighted the three former Bulls who were playing in the game. Of course, the game being in Chicago, Jerry Sloan, Norm Van Leer, and Clifford Ray. The game actually went into overtime, which a lot of the guys would have been pretty upset to see the score tied at the end of regulation, because at the advanced age into the 40s and 50s, the extra time wouldn't have gone down very well.
You're spot on with that. I think in the closing seconds of the second half, Doug Collins, who was the then Chicago Bulls head coach, hit a clutch three-pointer to actually extend the game to that overtime session where it was the first basket wins pretty much. Interestingly as well, the coaches of those 88 teams were none other than Johnny Red Kerr, and Bob Cousy was the other coach. Fantastic names there as well.
Yeah, it was great to see the first ever head coach of the Bulls, Johnny Kerr, get a Guernsey as the Eastern Conference coach in, I guess you could say, his home All-Star game.
Yeah, true. You have a quick look over that 1988 Legends game, and I think this was the fifth Legends game of the 1980s. It was around way earlier, back in the late 50s and mid-1960s briefly, but then it was brought back in 1984. So this was the fifth of the more recent reincarnation of the game. But having a look at some of the rosters, you've got Dave Cowens, John Havlicek, Calvin Murphy, the Big O, Oscar Robertson, Jamal Wilkes, Rick Barry, Dave Bing, Doug Collins, as I said. We've got Dolph Shays, Jerry Sloan, Norm Van Leer. I mean, absolute legends of the game, and obviously a very appropriately named contest.
And it was good to see the older guys play in these Legends games back when we were younger. I can understand the reason why they don't play them anymore, because there was a bit of a concern for the health of the players, being a little older than what they used to be, and maybe not up to the rigours of a full game anymore. But how cool would it be now, in our mid-30s, being able to watch a Legends Classic with guys who played in the 80s and 90s from when we were growing up, seeing guys like Barkley and Ewing and Jordan play in a Legends game. I think it'd be a wonderful thing to bring back.
Mate, don't even get me started. I would be beside myself if I got to see these guys play again now with the deep love of the game that I have, particularly from that era, to see these guys get out on the court again, even at their advanced ages in terms of basketball age at least, I'd just be beside myself. So that'd be very frightening as far as anybody within about a 10-metre radius of me at the time. The Legends game was actually ixnayed in 1993. That was the last game as far as I can tell. A few great names: George Gervin, Connie Hawkins, Spencer Haywood, even Rod Hundley, the Utah Jazz.
Hot Rod Hundley?
Yeah, Hot Rod Hundley from the Utah Jazz, the announcer. Stockton Malone! Him. He was even one of the players on the West squad as well, coached by Frank Layden.
Frank Layden, the one and only Frank Layden.
And there's a good segment too at the half as well concerning Frank Layden.
Yeah, he was there, the Utah Jazz head coach at the time, and I guess they asked him to do a bit of a feature on his weekend in Chicago, and well, more than 3/4 of it, probably like more around 85 to 90% of the other segment was him eating or talking about food. And then he also was going through a recruiting drive as well, handing Utah Jazz his business cards to all of the All-Stars of the weekend to try and get them to come and play for Utah, which I think's kind of funny. But the thing that I enjoyed most was when he was at a sports bar, I believe, eating, strangely enough, and watching the All-Star weekend festivities, the dunk competition and whatnot, on a big screen. Now, in 1988, a big screen wasn't a big screen as we know it today. It was a block of 36 regular-size TVs stacked one on top of each other and beside each other to make up one big screen, which I thought was pretty cool.
Yeah, interesting that so much of it related around the whole object of food for whatever reason, but he just played the funny man pretty much. And that's just quickly gets me thinking about the Dazzling Dunks and Basketball Bloopers release that was out in the very early 1990s, might have even been late 1980s, where Frank Layden was playing the funny man to Marv Albert as the straight man. And there were some fantastic moments in that we've been reminiscing about before we actually got to chatting today as well, mate.
Yes, that was one of those videos that I had when I was younger and one of those things that made me fall in love with the game. So definitely some good memories from that. A part of his recruiting drive in this halftime show in Chicago was a small piece where it was obviously during the dunk competition. It was in the locker room and he handed a business card to Dominique and he handed a business card to Clyde Drexler, and sitting in between them was Otis Smith from the Golden State Warriors, who for some reason didn't get a card.
Just must have been an oversight, surely. I know what you're saying, yeah, quite funny. Frank Layden was still the NBA head coach at that stage. He was coach of the Jazz, coached them for about 8 seasons. I think 1989 may have been the last season that he was involved as a head coach role, and I don't think he saw the whole season out either. So he just played the funny man. A great little segment, plenty of cheap laughs, and some good footage to look back on some 25 years later.
Definitely, mate. Definitely. All part of the mystique of the 1988 NBA All-Star Game.
True, mate. Now, in a future episode, we'll be talking a lot more about the 1988 All-Star weekend festivities as far as the three-point shootout and the slam dunk contest go, because they really deserve their own episode. We couldn't do it justice in a quick 5 or 10 minute chat.
Agreed. There's a reason why this is the greatest All-Star weekend in league history, and it's not just because of the game either. The three-point shootout and dunk competition themselves were epic and as you said, worthy of a podcast each almost.
Yep. We'll get into the second half of the game. What would you like to talk about in particular?
One of the players on the Eastern Conference squad that they were talking about was Brad Doherty of the Cavs and how he became a Cavalier. The Philadelphia 76ers actually owned the number 1 pick in the 1986 NBA draft and traded it to the Cleveland Cavaliers for Roy Hinton. Now, of course, that number 1 pick became Brad Doherty, who was one of the great super centers in the NBA in the late 80s and early 90s. And Roy Hinton, well, if you can tell me anything that he did after the 1988 season, you're doing well. So that was one of those really lopsided trades in league history.
Off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you anything more about Hinton beyond that as well, so I'd have to look back on his stats to even find out more about that. But yeah, even more interestingly as well, because I also looked back at this after I heard the talk about it in the All-Star game. If you head back to October of 1979, this pick was traded by the San Diego Clippers as a future 1986 first-round pick to the 76ers in exchange for Joe Jellybean Bryant. Now, of course, we know he's got a son that's in the NBA at the moment that most people are probably aware of. His name's Kobe.
Yes, for anyone under the age of 40, the man Joe Jellybean Bryant is a lot more famous for his son.
Exactly right, mate. That was just a little interesting side part to do with that overall, how that trade transpired, turning up to be the pick of Brad Doherty. And unfortunately, Doherty's career was ravaged by injury. He suffered terrible troubles with his back, which led to his early retirement before he was even 30 years of age. One of the greatest players to ever play the game, but retire abruptly due to severe injuries.
That's correct, mate. And as we move into the second half of the game, there was a question that I asked my good friend Adam Howes when he had his interview with Dominique just recently, a question that I wanted Adam to ask Nick, because at this All-Star weekend, if you look at the other slam dunk competition, it's kind of common knowledge that Dominique was robbed a little bit in the other dunk competition. MJ got a bit of hometown cooking with the judging of the other dunk competition. One of the questions that I asked Adam to ask Neek was, on the Sunday when he played in the All-Star game, in the second half of the game, he broke a then record of 16 field goal attempts in one half of an All-Star game. And if you watch that game, in particular in the fourth quarter, the amount of shots that Dominique jacks up is just, it's quite funny actually. And it makes me wonder if, because he got jibbed on All-Star Saturday with the dunk competition, if he wanted that MVP award.
Yeah, that is a very valid point. I've been giggling away from most of your introduction to that comment, but he still ended up with 54% from the field, Nick. Even though he may have been jacking up shots like there was no tomorrow in that second half, he still was 12 of 22. 29 points, and up till probably midway through the fourth quarter, him and MJ were toe-to-toe as far as scoring goes, but in the last 6 or so minutes of the fourth quarter, Jordan scored like 16 points, which pretty much secured him the MVP. But yeah, really interesting to note that Wilkins was certainly, it wasn't a little bit robbed, mate. Let's be honest. Jordan got the most outrageous home cooking in the history of cooking, whatever that even means. Jordan was certainly on the favourable side of that, judging from the 1988 All-Star Dunk Contest.
Nick threw down a two-handed windmill from the baseline in the dunk competition and got a 45. You could see after he got that score, there's some footage of him just sitting on the bench shaking his head in disbelief. But if you go back to the game, yeah, the amount of shots that he put up in the second half and in the last quarter, when I first saw the game, my first thought in my head was Nick's trying to outscore MJ to get that MVP award because of what happened in the dunk competition. But if you look at as many shots as what Nick put up in the game, Doc Rivers also wasn't gun shy at all in the All-Star game. So it may have had something to do with who was coaching the game as well. All of the missed shots that he got fouled on don't count as field goal attempts, but the amount of times that he took the ball to the hoop to score and got fouled, because I think that you'll find that he shot quite a few free throws.
I'm just looking at the stats now. He was 5 of 11 from the free throw line, so he obviously at least 4 or 5 times drove to the hoop and was hammered by somebody, and then that led to the free throw attempts.
Wasn't gun shy for his first All-Star game, I guess, is what I was getting at.
Sure, and of course, as you mentioned, his coach Mike Fratello was at the helm for the Eastern squad as well, so him and Wilkins were catered for nicely. In that third quarter, the East still outscored the West. It was 39-35. That's almost a halftime score in 2013 as far as regular NBA games go. So the scoring was at a premium and the defense, I guess, was non-existent. Another entertaining quarter. That led to the fourth and final quarter in which the West actually scored 44 points, but wasn't quite enough. The East still had 39 of their own, and they would hold on to win 138-133. So we had a really exciting and very fast-paced, again, fourth quarter where there's plenty of showtime and magnificent plays throughout.
There was a play at the end of the third quarter, which I'm sure that you'll remember because you watched the game in the last 24 hours, but there was a three-pointer, desperation three that Kareem put up at the end of the third quarter that missed, but they counted it because of offensive interference. Now, this dated the game by showing the lack of the 10 to 15 minute worth of replays that we now have to deal with in 2013 that they didn't have on hand at that time, because it was clearly one of his own teammates who interfered with the basket on that play.
Yeah, it was the big X-Man. He got up and held onto the rim briefly as the ball banked off the backboard, and initially, Kareem's basket was counted good as a three-pointer. So that initially he thought ended the quarter with him becoming the NBA All-Star Games all-time leading scorer. But as you said, it was waved off. Pat Riley did put him back into the game in those closing seconds, and they'd set up a play for him. And I think Billy Cunningham even said, I'd expect Patrick Ewing to let him score. Whoever was defending him at the time, he just assumed would just lay down and let Abdul-Jabbar just hit the score that he needed to get that all-time record. But that was a bit bizarre, I would have thought. But anyhow, he hit the right-hand hook shot, fading towards the Bulls bench, and that set the then all-time record. I think in the following year, Kareem scored 4 points in the 89 All-Star game, so it gave him 251 all-time points, which was the then all-time record. That was since eclipsed by Michael Jordan. He finished with 262 points all-time, and that has now been bested by Kobe Bryant, who at this stage, as of 2013, is the all-time leader with 280 points.
And I quite enjoyed the cheer and the recognition that Kareem got from the crowd at the All-Star game in Chicago when Pat Riley had him check back in late in the game to try to break the scoring record. He got a really good ovation from the other crowd in Chicago. That fourth quarter, though, was all about MJ. You mentioned before that Michael had 16 points in the last 6 minutes, and it was mentioned during the game that Larry Bird said before the game that it's Michael, the game's in his hometown, so he's going to look for him as much as he can. And every time Larry grabbed a defensive rebound, every single time he was looking for the outlet, tried to start the fast break, and hit MJ on more than one occasion.
Another thing as well of interest that I noticed while watching this game is just how great a player Bird was in terms of his reaction and instinct with the games. Like, he'd often intercept passes. There was even a time where James Worthy, I think, was on the floor and was trying to attempt a shot off the floor that Bird just batted away, just rejected it outright before it even had a chance to go close to the basket. You just see that he'd reach in and just get little intercepts. He just read the game so well, and this is probably around the time where he's at his peak, maybe a year or two past that. He was just such a great player to watch that even when he was not actually involved right around the ball, you still had to be fully aware of where he was and what he could do.
Yeah, there's a good reason why he was a 3-time NBA MVP in 3 consecutive years in the mid-'80s. And the way that he played and the way that the Magic played in this game, it definitely had an effect on the way that the other guys played in the game as well, because late in the fourth quarter, the West are on the break and you see 6'10" centre Akeem Olajuwon do this dipsy-do kind of Magic Johnson kind of pass on the break, and there was no chance of this pass missing, and the risk level was very low. He just added in a completely unnecessary little ball fake and threw it away to his teammates. So these guys had an effect not only on the game but also on their teammates and the way they played.
They're trying to turn everybody into showmen. Let's just have a quick breakdown of Jordan's stat line. When you hear these numbers, it's just absolutely off the charts. He had 40 points, so he was only 2 points shy of Wilt Chamberlain's all-time record of points in a single All-Star game of 42 back in 1962. So Jordan had 40 points. He shot 74% from the field, 17 of 23. He had 8 rebounds, 3 assists, and then 4 steals and 4 blocks, which is just ridiculous how great of a stat line that is when you look at that in isolation. Just incredible effort. And then to do that in front of his home crowd of Chicago on the national spotlight at a time when All-Star games actually still mattered and were important, that was just one of the all-time greatest performances in an All-Star game.
The 4 blocks and 4 steals were a good reflection on his defensive abilities that year, which ultimately led to him winning the Defensive Player of the Year in 1988. But 1988, Jordan was still raw. He was just an unbelievable offensive machine. I think later on in his career, once he'd had a few more seasons to hone his skill and develop his fadeaway and whatnot, he'd become more of a polished offensive weapon. But this 1988, Jordan was just a lethal offensive machine. He's described in Come Fly With Me as an offensive juggernaut, which really what he was in 1988, mate.
Yeah, undoubtedly. And actual season stats for 1988, he played the most number of minutes in his whole career in this season. It was 40.4 minutes a game. He averaged 35 points a contest, which was the second best of his scoring output ever. The season before was his best. And then along with that, he averaged 5.5 boards, almost 6 assists, over 3 steals. It was 3.2 steals, which was his all-time best mark for a single season. And just a lazy 1.6 blocks as well.
1.6 blocks as a 6'6" 2-guard. That's how good he was, mate, at that time.
Just ridiculously unbelievable. I might even throw in otherworldly, mate, which is one of my favourite go-to words on the podcast. But just some staggering numbers there, and great to see him come away with, of course, the obvious MVP nod, given his last quarter performance in the All-Star game as well. And it was great to see his mum and dad there as well. I think even Juanita was there in the background too, whilst Pat O'Brien and David Stern presented the MVP award to him on court following the game.
Yeah, they flashed to her at one point in time in the crowd as well, so she was definitely there at the game. And MJ actually also picked up a fifth personal foul in this game in the fourth quarter. And I was thinking to myself, now, what's the chance him being allowed to pick up a sixth foul and fouling out of this game in the fourth quarter? I reckon he could have just about ripped someone's arm off and smacked them over the head with it, and he wouldn't have got called for that sixth foul. Wouldn't you agree?
I would agree wholeheartedly. He'd have to actually pull out a weapon of some description and start indiscriminately firing to actually get that sixth foul at that stage. There's no way that he was going to get whistled for a sixth foul. And another thing as well, during the game, I think it was late in the fourth quarter, Magic Johnson got called for a travel as well, which I thought was actually outlawed, not only in just regular season games, but definitely in an All-Star game. You'd never think that somebody would be whistled for taking too many steps.
Adam, in my notes, along with the other travelling call, which, as you mentioned, is a rarity, and I thought it's outlawed in All-Star games, there was actually an illegal defense call. Do you remember that?
Oh, I do. So that's almost...
Illegal defense in an All-Star game. Wow.
Well, that's where defense was actually still played at that stage. Yeah, that actually leads us nicely into the next question that Hank McCoy asked us in the lead up to this chat. Feel free to submit your own question to us in the lead up to these topic episodes on Twitter and via the Facebook page. I do throw out a question from time to time in the lead up to these episodes, so feel free to chime in with your questions that you'd like to have answered or topics you'd like to have discussed, and we'll gladly talk about those. Hank McCoy, his second question was, what year do you think the competitive nature of the All-Star Games stopped? Now, clearly, it got to a certain point where the interest in All-Star Games and the fact that the players actually cared and tried, that started to wane severely. I'd probably suggest actually it would be in the very early 2000s is when it really started. Jordan retired in 98. That was his final All-Star game as a Bull. He came back, obviously, and played in a couple. Yeah, he did. That's right. He came back and played. Thanks to your dog there for chiming in. Edward, he played a couple of games. That's a professionalism personified there with the dog in the background.
I don't know if you've noticed it or not, but over the years, I've heard some BS reports with Bill Simmons.
Lawnmowers.
In
the background, he'd have lawnmowers.
And his phone going off, so don't sweat the puppy dog, right?
We'll keep that in there. That was great. Shout out to Antoine Carr and also Glenn Robertson if you're listening to this episode. Now, I'd say probably the early 2000s, even though Jordan did come back for the 2002, 2003 All-Star Games, I'd say by early 2000s, the All-Star Game started to lose its luster and its appeal, and the players pretty much just stopped playing defense by that stage. When do you actually think that the All-Star Game competitive nature really started to reduce there, mate?
I blame Kobe Bryant. And I also agree with you with the early 2000s being the time when the All-Star Game started to wane a bit in the quality of the basketball that was played. Kobe's first All-Star Game was in New York City in 1998, and he did a lot of his hot dogging in that game. And I reckon that was where the rot started to set in. And then you had guys like Vince Carter and Tracy McGrady. Yeah, I also firmly point the finger at.
I couldn't agree with you anymore there. 1999 was the lockout season, so there was no All-Star game just due to the fact that the labour negotiations were still ongoing, and because it was only a 50-game shortened season, the All-Star game was actually cancelled altogether, so that's when it really started to take a turn for its worse. And it pretty much just became matador defence, like you just virtually stand out of the road and just let people do their dunks, and it was almost disrespecting the game. As a purist of the game, I'd say it almost disrespected the actual fact that they just pretty much stood aside and let these sort of plays happen. It only really got to the last couple of minutes of the fourth quarter when the defense might sort of step up a little bit if it was a close contest. But for most of the time, from the 2000s onwards, it just became pretty much a who can top this as far as just highlights that were uncontested D.
Yeah, you had the flashy plays and whatnot in games in the 80s and 90s and whatnot. I mean, for God's sake, in 88, Isaiah Thomas tried to throw an alley-oop to Dominique off a bounce pass off the floor. You can't get much more flashy and hot dogging than that. But the game itself, though, was actually played in the right spirit and competitive. So that's the other thing, the major thing that separates the All-Star games of today compared to 20 and 30 years ago.
Yeah, the key word there is competitive. That's when it still was competitive. He did that play. It was in traffic as well. He just bounced it over about 6 blokes and just hoped that Neek got up high enough. He almost actually did corral the ball. But interestingly enough, in a later regular season game, many years down the track, probably 5 or 6 years later, Isaiah pulled out the same bounce pass on an alley-oop to Gerald Glass for the dunk.
In a game, no less. That's has to be ranked as one of the top 5 or 10 passes in NBA history. Extraordinary play.
Yeah, it was, and Gerald Glass almost butchered the dunk attempt, but he got it to go down. But yeah, that was an incredible pass from Thomas, probably in his last couple of years of his career in the early to mid 1990s. Now, the final score of the game, mate, with the East hung on to win 138 to 133. I think Magic Johnson put up a standing 50-foot hook with about 3 seconds left, which was rebounded and put back in by Alex English for the last 2 points of the game. So it was a 5-point win to the East. Jordan was the MVP. Other scorers for the game. For the East, as we mentioned, Neek was right up there with MVP contention until at least into the early fourth quarter. He had 29 points and 5 boards on 12 of 22 from the field. The only other double-digit scorers for the East were Ainge and Brad Doherty. The scoring load was mostly MJ, Neek, Ainge and Doherty. And for the West, the mailman, Karl Malone, 22 and 10, and Akeem Olajuwon, who was still Akeem at that stage. He hadn't added the H to his first name. He had 21 points and 9 boards.
I thought it was good of Karl Malone in the fourth quarter too. It was such an exciting, especially the last half of that last quarter, very exciting end-to-end NBA action, as they used to say on the advertisements. It was very good of Karl Malone to completely destroy the up-tempo flow of the game by at one point in time shooting a 15-foot jump shot.
I can't believe you mentioned that because I saw it as well when I was watching the fourth quarter. I thought, hey, what? He's just spotting up for a jumper.
For a jump shot.
That is
jump
ridiculous.
Shot in the All-Star game. He was that happy with himself even back in 1988 that, he thought it'd be a good idea to show everyone his jump shooting skills from mid-range.
He was on the right wing about 18 feet out and just hit a jump shot with no one around him. So yeah.
Well done, Carl. Well done.
Yeah, interesting. We both noticed that. We both noticed that play. I think we already mentioned Magic had 19 assists and Isaiah had 15. So they were the main stat getters as far as the East and West squads go.
I've got another very interesting stat. I like to bring up these bits and pieces about the games that we talk about how much they date the game that we're talking about. Just previous to the game in 88, Danny Ainge broke the NBA record, or set the NBA record for most consecutive games with a made three-pointer with 23, and I think this last week passed in December of 2013. Kyle Korver, one of my biggest ever white boy crushes when he played with the Bulls, but currently of the Atlanta Hawks, unfortunately, set the record with 93 consecutive games with a made three-pointer, which I thought was a very good indicator as to how important the other three is in 2013 compared to 1988.
Well said. A very telling statistic there. And as well as that, just to even add further credence to what you just said, in 1988, that was only the third instance where they ran the three-point shootout as well. So Larry Bird won the first three-point shootouts, but they only commenced in 1986. That even just showed you then the relevance of the three-point shot was only just really realising its full potential. And, of course, 25 years later, it's a huge part of the modern NBA.
And as we mentioned earlier on, those two events, the dunk competition and the three-point shootout from the All-Star Saturday festivities, will get their own podcast because the anticipation of the competitions due to the participants, the rematch between Dominique and Jordan in the dunk competition, and the way that Larry Bird finished off the three-point shootout made them as big a part of the aura of the All-Star weekend as what the game did.
Great point there, mate. So we will get to those in their own episode for sure.
It's a bit hard to convey. Just hopefully we've done some kind of justice because it's just from a history standpoint with the players in the game, it being in Chicago and Jordan almost breaking the single game record and winning the MVP and winning the slam dunk competition, and just some of the plays in the game, some of MJ's dunks, he's behind the head block on Karl Malone, which led to his double clutch two-hander on the break, and like the alley-oop from Isaiah to him right at the very end of the game. It was just an awesome game to watch. So hopefully we've done it some justice.
At the time that alley-oop from Thomas to Jordan happened in the closing seconds, Dick Stockton was already saying how great the game had been and how there had been so many exciting plays and wonderful passing displays. And then right on cue, Zeke throws that almost half-court alley-oop to Jordan for the dunk. That was pretty much the
exclamation
mark. That, in a nutshell, mate, you've just put a great close on that conversation. I hope you have enjoyed listening to this as much as Aaron and I have enjoyed talking about it. Thanks again for listening to another episode of the show. Aaron, as I do like to say as well, I encourage the listener to interact with the show. They can suggest topics, as we mentioned in the episode, suggest topics for future episodes or some guests that you'd like to hear conversations with. You can also leave voicemail comments or questions on my website or the Facebook page. Since the last episode, there's been some more great iTunes feedback which was added. I wanted to thank Brendan Beek, who added a really good review on the iTunes Australia store. It's really nice of him to say, and thank you, Brendan. He wrote, "Adam, good stuff, mate. Too many of us daydream about doing something like your show for the things that we're passionate about, but never actually make the leap and do it. Your podcast brings back great memories of growing up an NBA fan in Australia. Hope you managed to keep the podcast and the site going. I wonder if it might be time to put together a highlight show that brings together some of the great stories from different episodes. Keep up the good work and great podcast." So, first of all, thank you very much, Brendan, for that great review. And he makes a really good point there, Aaron, about maybe putting together a best-of sort of episode. What do you think?
I think it's quite good timing, actually, because I'm also here to announce that Adam is putting together a 6-disc pack just in time for Christmas.
And I didn't even know this myself.
No, he's spot on, though. Like, he talks about daydreaming, and I enjoyed doing this with you, mate, thoroughly. This is stuff that I think about all day, every day, and I was also fortunate enough to write a piece for Adam House's blog that we mentioned before, just on the current state of the 2013-14 Chicago Bulls, and like to do something like that and to talk to you here on this podcast is a lot of fun because it's really enjoyable and quite cathartic to be able to put your thoughts and your grievances and your opinions out there for people like to see and read. So you'd feel the same way, I'm sure. So like to get some positive feedback from your listeners like that is wonderful.
Thank you, mate. And I appreciate you joining me for many of these podcast episodes that we've been talking about, all these previous memories that we've both experienced over the years. So thank you very much for being on the show for the amount of times that you have. Your run ends at this episode. That's a bit unfortunate, mate.
Oh, yeah, as you mentioned before, you were unaware about the other 6-disc set that was coming out for Christmas. I was also unaware of the fact that I was about to be fired, so...
Just kidding. I hope you're going to continue to join me for many more in the future. But just a couple of quick things before we tie and bow on this episode, mate. Worldwide, the show currently has 25 reviews and... Hang on, I said 35-star ratings last time. It's only got 29. That's concerning. Oh, well. I'll just update those stats. As of episode 38, the show now has 31 ratings. 29 of them are 5-star. Thanks again, Brendan, for your great review. If you add a review, I'd love to mention your name in a future episode. As I like to say, your ratings and reviews are like the ultimate assist. Aaron, do you have any suggestions for who that could be?
There was a gentleman in the crowd who we all know and love at the 88 All-Star game. Forgot to mention him. I had him on my notes. It's the ultimate Paul McKeskey assist.
He was in the crowd, was he? I didn't actually see him in there. I didn't notice him. But, yeah, shout out to Paul McKeskey. You spoke fondly of Mr. McKeskey back in episode 36, the one about Michael Jordan's high-score game of 69 points. You spoke fondly of Paul McKeskey, so thanks very much for that. So it's the ultimate Paul McKeskey assist. So that helps me to reach a wider audience for the podcast, and that in turn will give you, as a listener, more opportunity to hear conversations with great guests, including my co-host, Mr. Aaron Steen.
Yes, the more positive reviews that you leave of the other show, it increases our budget as well. So quality of the product that will be delivered to you will also improve. Because whilst recording this episode, apparently Adam's actually lost about 2 or 3 of his 5-star reviews in the last hour or so.
Thank you if you have taken the time to leave a review or add a rating. I really do appreciate it. You can add your ratings by going to inallairness.com/iTunes. Or also through Stitcher, which is one of the podcatchers I like to recommend. If you go to inallairness.com/Stitcher, that'll also now take you to my In All Airness page on the Stitcher website. and you can also add a review or a rating there as well, which currently there are none. So I'd really appreciate it if you do listen through Stitcher to quickly add that for me. That would be very nice of you to do that. You can subscribe to the show on iTunes or just look at the RSS feed on the right-hand sidebar of my website. As I mentioned, you can hear the show on Stitcher, Player FM, and other podcatchers. Thank you, Aaron, for joining me.
Thank you, Adam. Yes, I use and recommend In All Airness.
Anything you want to quickly add, mate, before we do wrap it up?
Giddy up.
Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed the show and share my web address with your friends and colleagues. inallairness.com. Check out the podcast archive for plenty more episodes with high-profile guests. Follow me on Twitter at inallairness. Please add your like to the show's social hub, facebook.com/inallairness. Join me next time for another edition of the show.